In the summer months of 1984, San Francisco was gripped by fear. Neighbors, family and friends were vanishing without a trace. The police were perplexed and the investigation took a deadly turn when a killing field was uncovered high in the California mountains. As the body count climbed, the evidence pointed to an elusive killer. To bring this murderer to justice, a small-town prosecutor took a long, dark journey into the mind of a serial killer.
Being the one who took this recording.
On the morning of October the 26th, 1998, the longest and most expensive criminal trial in California history began, surpassing even the O.J. Simpson trial. With an investigation spanning 13 years and a case file weighing over 2 tons, the burden of prosecuting one of California's most notorious killers would fall to Peter Smith, the district attorney of Calaveras County.
A prosecutor's job is to seek justice. I think many people look at prosecutors and think their job is to convict and put people in jail or prison, and that's part of the job too. But it really is our responsibility to make sure the justice system, particularly the criminal justice system, is carried out fairly to the point where justice is always sought.
On June the 2nd, 1985, a South San Francisco dispatch operator received a call. A theft was in progress at South City Lumber.
31 Boy 1, 1087 Robert 1 at South City Lumber, Railroad and Spruce, on a 488 shoplifting.
Officer Daniel Wright of the South San Francisco Police Department responded to the call. When he arrived, a witness told Wright he'd seen an Asian male stealing a table vise. He said the thief, when confronted, threw the vise into the boot of the car and fled on foot. Inside the car, Wright spotted a suspicious-looking case.
I opened up the case and found a .22 Ruger with a cylinder-shaped object that was probably 6 to 9 inches long. And through my training, I observed it to be a silencer.
The gun was illegally modified. As Wright took a closer look, an agitated man burst from the store. He told the officer he'd paid for the vise his friend had taken. Wright's supervisor, Sergeant Paul Zima, arrived on the scene. The gun gave them grounds to impound the car. On the way to the station, the man told Zima the shoplifter's name was Charles Ng. The officer used his radio to request a background check on Ng. They were successful. Ng was a former Marine born in Hong Kong. He'd been convicted in military court for stealing automatic weapons from a military base in Hawaii, and he'd once escaped from a military prison. At the South San Francisco police station, the subject was placed in a secure holding room. He told the officer his name was Leonard Lake. He said he was a fugitive from justice and offered to make a statement. But first, he wanted a piece of paper, a pencil, and a glass of water.
Write your statement. I'll be back in a few minutes.
Zima left the room to summon Gary Hopper, the on-call detective that Sunday. When they returned, Lake was on the floor, convulsing.
Oh my God! Zima!
He was flopping around on the floor. It was very violent, like a fish flapping out of water, and uncontrollable. But we had no idea what was happening at the time, whether it was like an epileptic seizure or just what was going on.
Detective Hopper called the paramedics.
Once the paramedics got into the emergency hospital, we found out a little later that they were finding no activity at all in his brain, and he was apparently brain dead.
An autopsy later revealed that Lake had ingested cyanide capsules.
The doctor told me, and the lab technicians told me that it took about 20 to 25 minutes for the gel cap to dissolve before the cyanide actually hit his system. And that would probably coincide fairly well with the amount of time between he was at the lumber yard and brought to the police station.
Rather than writing a statement, Lake had written a note to a woman named Lynn. The note read, "Dear Lynn, I love you. I forgive you. Freedom is better than all else. I'm sorry, Mum, Patty, and all. I'm sorry for all the trouble. Love, Leonard." Police were perplexed. Why had the suspect taken his own life? Whatever secrets Leonard Lake held, he took to the grave. California police were embroiled in an intriguing case. Did the answer lie with a man called Charles Ng? Police issued a warrant for his arrest for shoplifting. They processed the car he'd been driving. When they ran the serial number on its engine block, investigators discovered the car belonged to Paul Costner, a Bay Area resident who'd been missing for 7 months.
Hello?
Detective Irene Brunn of the San Francisco Police Department investigated Costner's disappearance. Costner's sister had reported him missing months earlier.
I'll be in a half hour.
And she was quite distraught. Her brother had disappeared. He had had a date that evening with his girlfriend for dinner, who also lived in the same apartment building where he lived. He failed to show up for that dinner date, and in speaking to the girlfriend, Paul was going to show a car that he was selling through an advertisement in the paper.
Costner was only one of many strange cases involving missing persons in the Bay Area. Detective Brunn was also investigating the disappearance of an entire family. On July the 25th, 1984, San Francisco police responded to a call. Harvey Dubbs, his wife, and their 16-month-old son Sean hadn't been seen for several days. Police had to climb through a window to gain access to the Dubbs apartment.
San Francisco Police Department, anybody on the premises?
The Dubbs family had disappeared, and the signs of a struggle were apparent. Days earlier, Harvey Dubbs had placed an ad in the newspaper to rent out his video equipment. That equipment was now missing. Missing person cases usually fit a certain profile. They often involve teenage runaways or people who disappear without telling anyone, only to return a few days later. In the case of the Dubbs, it was clear the family hadn't left voluntarily. Detective Brunn feared they would never return.
In the house, there were things that were unusual and out of order. The baby's room was out of order. Deborah's medication was left at home, and it was something she had to take every day. So there were a lot of things that didn't look right. They left their cats locked in the house unattended, and they wouldn't have done that.
It's unusual for people like Paul Costner or the Dubbs family to simply vanish without a trace. Without leads, both cases had gone cold.
To be realistic, we get 500 a month. We had one family disappeared July 25th. Now we're up to November 2nd. So because of the caseload, you're not trying to pin cases together. The only similarity was a newspaper ad.
Based on the discovery of Paul Costner's car, Brunn and her partner reopened his case and searched the vehicle for clues. They found a driver's license belonging to a man named Scott Stapley. They found a stun gun and several unspent bullets on the floor of the car. A recent electric bill addressed to an unknown woman named Clarelyn Ballars was found under the passenger seat. And in the roof of the car, investigators found a single bullet hole.
Can you see that from up there, partner?
Like 22 or 25 caliber.
The trajectory of the bullet indicated the shot was fired from the back seat.
Hey,
The
John.
investigators sprayed luminol around the interior of the vehicle. Luminol reacts with proteins in blood, making even traces of blood fluoresce. A high-velocity blood spatter pattern associated with a gunshot wound appeared on the roof next to the front passenger seat. Brunn and her partner now suspected they would never find Costner alive. With Leonard Lake dead and his partner Charles Ng at large, investigators could only wonder how many more victims they might find at the end of this trail of blood. Leonard Lake's mysterious suicide had now launched a full-scale police investigation. Brunn and her partner drove to Leonard Lake's mother's house, about an hour outside San Francisco.
Hi, ma'am, I'm Detective Tom Eisenman.
At the house, they made a surprising discovery. The woman whose name appeared on the electric bill found in Costner's car, Clarelyn Ballars.
Okay.
She was Lake's ex-wife. They'd been married for 3 years, but divorced a year earlier.
Thank you, Miss Lake. It's been a long drive up. This shouldn't take very long. Miss Ballard,
It seemed that she might be the woman Lake addressed in his suicide note. They asked Ballars how an electric bill in her name would end up in Paul Costner's car. Ballars explained the address on the bill was for a cabin her family owned in Calaveras County in Northern California. Although Brunn and her partner were eager to search the cabin, Ballars claimed she was too busy to take them there until the next day. The detectives postponed their search until the following morning and instructed Ballars not to visit the property in the meantime.
So we called the Calaveras Sheriff's Department and told them that we were going to be coming up the following morning and why we were going and if it was possible for them to have somebody keep an eye on the property.
Calaveras County covers over 2,800 square kilometers of wild terrain. A force of 34 officers protected the entire county in 1985. There hadn't been need for more. The sheriff sent 2 deputies to watch the cabin, which was located outside the town of Wilseyville. A metal gate prevented them from driving onto the property.
Because of their manpower shortage, they couldn't have somebody sit there for the next 24 hours, but they would make passing calls, which was reasonable.
The following morning, Brunn and her partner had arranged to meet Clarelyn Ballars outside the Wilseyville post office. They were surprised when she arrived with Lake's mother.
And at that point, Carolyn admitted that they had driven up the night before. And the pretext was that Leonard was very untidy and they wanted to tidy up the cabin.
Concerned that Ballars and Lake's mother might have compromised evidence of the cabin, Brunn, her partner, and the Calaveras County sheriffs followed them to the property. The detectives asked Ballars about a cinder block bunker near the cabin. She said she didn't have the key, and wouldn't give them permission to search it. Lacking sufficient probable cause for a warrant, the detectives would have to limit their search to the cabin alone.
But at this point, we were still more interested in getting into the house, so we didn't want to antagonize her. because this was a consent search. Other than that, we would have had to stop and go get a search warrant at that point.
While her partner questioned Balazs, Detective Brunn searched the house. She noticed something odd about the bed. There were holes drilled into the bedposts and the floor. It seemed designed to tie someone up.
And I was standing in front of this bookcase, and I happened to turn around, and all of a sudden I recognized a piece of equipment. And then it dawned on me where I had seen it. It was the Dubs.
The video equipment, Brunn recalled, had been stolen from the home of Harvey Dubs, the San Francisco man who'd vanished with his family 11 months earlier.
So I went over and called my office. I said, would you mind checking our inventory and read me the serial number? He proceeded to start reading the serial number, and then I gave him the last three numbers from the piece of paper that I had in my hand. And so at that point we realized that now this is even getting bigger. It's not just Mr. Cosner, now we have the Dubs. And at that point Clara Lynn got very nervous and said, you've been here long enough, I want you to leave.
To learn what other secrets the isolated cabin held, Detective Brunn would need to obtain a search warrant. The investigators left the property, but this time they made certain the cabin would be secure until they returned. Ron McFall led the investigation for the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office.
We did get one that day, and later that afternoon we went back to the residence to conduct a search of the residence and the property and what looked like a tool shed at first.
The tool shed was a cinder block structure that bordered the driveway. Claralyn Balazs referred to it as the fallout shelter.
Got it.
Good, good.
Leonard Lake had been a survivalist, and this was his fortress against nuclear holocaust.
And we went into the tool shed and we saw 21 photos of young ladies 18 to 23 years old. And so we were, at that point, really concerned about who are these females, who are these ladies.
Many of the photos were of young girls in various stages of undress. It was unclear who the subjects were or where they'd been photographed.
That's her.
Everyone feared the pictures might be trophies such as those serial killers keep of their victims. They also found a journal written by Leonard Lake. In it, he wrote of The Collector, a novel about a butterfly collector who captures his ultimate prize, a young girl named Miranda. In his journal, Lake writes, "The Collector, has it really been near 20 years I've carried this fantasy? And Miranda, how fitting my lovely little prisoner of the future." In other entries, Lake referred to a series of operations under the heading of the Miranda Project. The investigators could only speculate as to what this meant, but it seemed ominous.
Come here, Ron. Okay. And you'll see where there's some, what appears to be...
90 meters from the bunker, Ron McFall and the other investigators noticed the ground had been scarred by a fire.
We noticed at that point approximately 7 different burn sites on the property. We decided to look at the burn sites a little further, and we found what we thought may be bone fragments, but we really weren't sure.
If the piles of ash did contain human bone fragments, someone had attempted to conceal an unspeakable horror. Now, desperate for answers, Investigators ran the license plates of a vehicle parked near the cabin. It belonged to Lonnie Bond, Lake's neighbor.
Hello, anybody in the house?
Lonnie Bond lived with his wife and 18-month-old son in a house next door to Lake's cabin. Officers went next door to speak to Bond.
Anybody here? Anybody home?
The smell of decayed food thickened the air. The house appeared to have been empty for some time, perhaps months. Although it seemed the occupants departed abruptly, there was no sign of foul play.
Looks like they all just disappeared.
Another vehicle found on Lake's property belonged to Robin Scott Stapley, who'd been missing for some time, and his driver's license was found in Paul Costner's car.
Leonard Lake has used Scott Stapley's driver's license because they were both big fellas, and he had been trying to pass himself off as Scott Stapley. So we're contacting Southern California to see, where is Scott Stapley? And it turns out that he had been living at the cabin next door, and no one has seen them either.
Investigators intensified their search. Cadaver dogs, known for their acute sense of smell, were brought in to help. Authorities now suspected that 8 missing people from Northern California were linked to the cabin. If they had been murdered, as police feared, perhaps their bodies were buried on the property.
Hey, Rick, come here.
One of the dogs recovered a piece of bone. The deputies working the scene knew immediately that this was not an animal bone. With the discovery of human remains, what had been a missing persons case now became a homicide investigation. Investigators declared Leonard Lake's property a crime scene and assembled a task force to process the cabin and surrounding property. Due to the expanding scope of the case, the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office called in additional help. Specialists from the San Francisco Police Department, the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office, and the California Department of Justice arrived to help with the investigation. 3 days after Leonard Lake's suicide, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles descended on the property. Now that this was a murder investigation, police knew that all the material recovered from the site could become vital to the eventual prosecution of the case. Each section of the property was assigned to a specific team. The teams began a thorough search of the 2 acres surrounding the cabin. In a clearing not far from the cabin, officers found a trench with loose dirt. They found the trench had been filled with personal belongings and debris.
Hey, Officer Ballard, I got something.
Sergeant Larry Copeland, an investigator for the Calaveras County Sheriff's Office, joined in the search for clues. A serial killer's lair was in the process of being painstakingly searched in California's remote hills. During this phase, they made a major discovery. There was a secret door inside the bunker.
It was a false door. You really couldn't tell just by looking at it, but there was a shelving unit, and after you wiggled the shelves, you saw that the door actually popped open.
Beyond the shelves was a double door leading to a hidden room.
The inner chamber itself.
Off to the side was another 1 meter by 2 meter compartment. The cramped space contained a homemade wooden bed, a crude shelf holding some toiletries, and a roll of toilet paper. A small hole had been cut into the wall near the ceiling, possibly for ventilation.
There was absolutely nothing hanging on it.
A tight list of rules was affixed to one wall. They included, "I must always be ready to service my master," and must never speak unless spoken to. I must always be obedient and never look my master in the eye. From outside, investigators could see into the small room through a two-way mirror. They also noticed that the hinges of the door had been damaged.
You'll further notice the hinges are bent from obviously pressure from inside the door pushing out, trying to get the door open, both the top and bottom hinges.
Remembering Lake's journal, investigators feared that Lake had acted upon his fantasy of kidnapping and holding captive a human slave. Forensic specialists dusted for fingerprints and latent evidence. They hoped that if Lake had kept a prisoner here, he or she had left behind some clue of their presence. They found nothing. As the search of the property outside the bunker continued, an investigator noticed some loose soil next to the driveway. Here they found a 22-liter plastic paint container. As darkness fell, the task force suspended its search. Inside the cabin, the investigators viewed one of the videotapes they'd found buried in the plastic container. They could hardly believe what they were seeing. This case was becoming more frightening with each piece of evidence they uncovered, but nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. The tape depicted two women suffering extreme verbal and psychological abuse at the hands of Leonard Lake and his accomplice, who demanded sexual submission under the threat of violence.
We also observed an Asian male on the tape, and he had a knife in his hand, and he was cutting the clothing. This would be the blouse, the top, as well as the bra strap, removing clothes from the female.
The Asian male was identified as Charles Ng, a shoplifter Leonard Lake had identified just prior to his suicide. The Homicide Division of the San Francisco Police Department launched a full-scale manhunt for Charles Ng. Investigators started with a search of Ng's San Francisco apartment. They collected some video equipment and a number of videotapes. Everything was tagged as evidence and sent for analysis. San Francisco homicide detective Ed Erdelatz led a task force that investigated the disappearance of the Dubs family. The equipment Lake and Ng had used to videotape their captives had once belonged to Harvey Dubs.
Investigators had obtained his California driver's license photo and had made up a photo collage, showed it to neighbors, and identified him as one of the people coming out of the Dubs home.
One of the Dubs' neighbors told investigators that the night before the family was reported missing, she saw two men leaving their residence. One of the men was carrying a large bag. It was dark, but she said she could identify him. The eyewitness's crucial identification of Charles Ng gave investigators probable cause to issue an arrest warrant. Claralyn Balazs, Leonard Lake's ex-wife, was questioned about her ex-husband's association with Charles Ng. She agreed to talk, but only after her attorney convinced the district attorney's office to grant her immunity from prosecution. Balazs claimed she didn't know anything about the murders. She told them that after the shoplifting incident, Ng walked straight to her house. The two drove back to the lumberyard to see if Lake was all right.
Well, I started feeling bad about it.
When they saw him talking to the police, they returned to her house. There they waited, expecting a call from Lake, who was now in police custody. When he didn't call, Claralyn drove Ng to his apartment. Ng told Claralyn he had to leave town.
She said that she thought he would probably go to Chicago, that he had mentioned that he would go to Chicago if he had to get out of town. And she claims that that was the last that she saw of him.
Because Ng was wanted for murder, and there was reason to believe he'd fled the state, the California investigators asked for assistance from the FBI. In response, the Bureau launched a massive manhunt for Charles Ng. At San Francisco International Airport, agents learned that a passenger fitting Ng's description had boarded a plane to Chicago, traveling under the name Mike Kimoto. In Chicago, agents worked to track Ng's movements. They started with an extensive background check. Investigators knew that Charles Ng was born in Hong Kong and entered the United States on a student visa in 1979. He enlisted in the Marine Corps, but was eventually arrested for stealing weapons. He escaped from prison and, on the advice of a friend, hid out with Leonard Lake and his wife Claralyn. Ng stayed with Lake and his wife for 6 months in Philo, California. At the same time, ATF agents were building a case against Lake for possession of illegal firearms. In the spring of 1981, they arrested both Lake and Ng. Lake skipped bail and began his life as a fugitive. Ng was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence.
Ng was released from prison in 1984 and immediately came back to the San Francisco Bay Area, was picked up at the airport by Claralyn Balaz, and rejoined his buddy Leonard Lake.
Charles Ng was an experienced fugitive with a wide network of friends who could help him. To develop more leads, the FBI placed Ng on their 10 most wanted list. For the time being, agents focused on Ng's friends and acquaintances in the Chicago area. As the investigation into Charles Ng expanded, the body count in Calaveras County continued to climb. Not far from Lake's cabin, investigators unearthed 2 intact bodies wrapped in sleeping bags. Calaveras County Coroner Terry Parker was on the scene.
They were mostly skeletal remains that were wrapped. Couldn't really make out if they were men or women because of the time that the bodies had been there.
Due to the deterioration of the bodies, Parker could only make a cursory examination at the site. It appeared both victims had been gagged and handcuffed. He asked for help from the San Francisco medical examiner.
San Francisco has a very good forensic department, and he was more than happy to come up and assist us. We removed the bodies and transported them to his office for the forensic work where that was done.
At the autopsy, the San Francisco medical examiner determined both victims were males and that they died from gunshot wounds. Using dental records, he identified the men as Lake's neighbors, Lonnie Bond and Scott Stapley. In Chicago, the FBI got their first lead. They found that after serving time on the weapons charge, Ng had kept in touch with his former cellmate. A man described how he'd driven Ng first to Detroit and then to the border town of Chatham. There, he said, they split up. A witness came forward and told agents he'd seen Ng board a bus in Chatham, bound for Toronto. Agents were aware that Ng's sister lived there. The FBI deployed a surveillance team at her apartment house, but the fugitive never arrived. After days of following Ng, the trail grew cold. A suspected serial killer was now roaming free in Canada. As word of the multiple murders spread, the news media descended on the property in Calaveras County. Don Lasseter is a true crime author who wrote a book on the Charles Ng case.
And of course, the media, when they first heard of this, rushed to the site, and daily the media coverage grew, and it got coverage all over California, and soon all over the United States, and certainly even in Canada.
Okay, Ron, open the gate.
The investigators agreed to let the media on the property. They showed them the site and allowed them to videotape some of the evidence they'd collected.
These are some of the bone fragments that have been found. Investigators say there are countless fragments just like these scattered over a third of an acre here. The California Conservation Corps has been recruited to pick up the bones. Most of them worked on their hands and knees, breaking the ground with their fingers. Investigators came up with 10 pounds of bones.
Investigators were counting on the media exposure to help identify the 21 women whose photographs were on the wall of Lake's bunker.
When they were taken, we're interested in knowing anything we can about Mr. Lake and Mr. Ng.
A telephone hotline was set up by the Calaveras Sheriff's Department, and calls soon began pouring in.
We have investigated all leads.
Detectives believed Leonard Lake and Charles Ng crossed paths with as many as 25 people who were later reported missing.
Property in Calaveras County.
Working under San Francisco investigator Ed Erdelatz, the task force tried to piece together any lead that would locate Ng or help identify the growing list of victims.
Anybody that had anything to do with either Lake or Ng, we attempted to identify and find out if they were still alive, and if they were, what their relationship was. And it was through that process that we began to identify different victims.
Members of the task force were sent out with photos of personal belongings found on the property in an effort to identify anyone who'd been at the cabin. Relatives and friends realized the missing might be among the dead. There was the Dubs family from San Francisco, who placed an ad in a newspaper to rent their video equipment and were never heard from again. Randy Jacobson, a friend of Leonard Lake's, was found buried near a chicken coop behind the cabin. Jeff Gerald, who worked with Ng at a San Francisco moving company, disappeared along with his friend Clifford Peranto, who worked at the same company. Ng's longtime friend Mike Carroll and his girlfriend Kathleen Allen had disappeared. Lake's neighbors were also missing. Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor and their 16-month-old child, Lonnie Jr. Their friend Robin Scott Stapley had vanished with them, and finally Paul Costner, whose car had originally led investigators on this trail of kidnapping and murder. The task force received one bit of good news.
We finally caught a break on this one. We were able to ID all these women, and they're all still alive.
Finding the girls alive was a relief, but Lake's property still held many mysteries. Agents feared they'd never know the complete story of the Calaveras County murders unless they found Charles Ng. After weeks of searching, they'd still not located the fugitive. Then, on July the 6th, 1985, a boy riding his bicycle in a Canadian park spotted the perfect place for a play fort. But he found that a man was living there. He went to the police and told them he'd found a campsite and had seen a man who looked like Charles Ng. The boy recognized him from wanted posters. He led police to the makeshift shelter, only to find that Ng had fled.
The campsite's clear. He's gone.
Later that same day, Charles Ng made the mistake investigators had been waiting for. Ironically, it was the same mistake that started the police investigation a month earlier.
Oh, please, no. Check him. Okay, I'll do that.
A security guard confronted a young Asian male as he slipped stolen merchandise into his knapsack in a Calgary department store. As the security guard struggled with the gunman, he was shot in the hand, but he managed to wrestle the weapon from him and hold him until police arrived. Charles Ng was captured and booked on charges of attempted murder, robbery, and possession of a firearm.
Channel 10, Eyewitness News, Night Watch. Yeah.
Good evening, Hopping Night Watch. Charles Ng is in a Canadian jail tonight, and a worldwide manhunt is headed for the front.
Hey Ron, come take a look at the news.
At last, the information they were waiting for. News of Ng's arrest in Canada reached the sheriff's office in Calaveras County.
But not before he engaged them in a brief gun battle, and wounded him with a cigar. Ng was quickly pursued by store patrons and was taken into police custody.
San Francisco Police Inspector Ed Erdelatz flew to Calgary, where serial killer Charles Ng was being held in a maximum security prison.
And we spent quite a few hours with Charles in the detention center in Calgary. And although he did talk with us, most of his responses were 1- and 2-word answers, very little dialogue, and primarily denial. We could have gone into a lot of things had he been willing to talk to us about those things, but that didn't occur.
The murders Ng claimed were all the work of Leonard Lake. When pressed, Ng did admit to Erdelatz that he'd helped Lake dispose of the bodies of Lonnie Bond and Scott Stapley the day after they were murdered. In Calaveras County, the district attorney's office indicted Ng on 12 counts of first-degree murder, making it possible for the prosecution to seek the death penalty. But Ng's flight to Canada had created a significant obstacle. District Attorney Pete Smith explains.
There was an extradition treaty between the United States and Canada at the time, and in that extradition treaty there was a condition that nobody would be extradited from Canada back to the United States who faced the death penalty.
There were some exceptions to the treaty, however.
Do you think we can work around that?
If the district attorney's office could prove to a Canadian court that Ng was guilty of multiple murders, Canada would be required to hand over the suspected killer. Before the extradition hearing could begin, Ng would have to stand trial in Canada on shoplifting and assault charges. In order to delay his extradition, Ng waived his right to a jury trial and asked for a speedier bench trial. He received a 4.5-year sentence. Until he completed that sentence, the Calaveras County District Attorney could not initiate the complicated extradition process. Even if they could prove their case, they'd have to wait over 4 years before they could begin.
You're dealing with two governments, so you have the delay in the bureaucracy of two governments, getting the paperwork through, confirming that the paperwork is done correctly. Then you have to, then both sides, people who represented Mr. Ng and the people who represented the government, including the United States, California, and the County of Calaveras, had to review the case, had to know the case, because in essence they were trying the case in front of a magistrate in Canada so that the magistrate could make a decision whether there was sufficient evidence to show that Mr. Ng was involved in these murders.
While the Calaveras County District Attorney's Office built their case against Charles Ng, the search for evidence continued at Leonard Lake's cabin. By this time, 5 bodies had been found and identified. Hundreds of personal effects had been recovered. more than 18 kilograms of unidentifiable human remains had been unearthed. Investigators believed that as many as 25 missing people had been linked to the cabin. As evidence against Ng continued to grow, he used his time in a Canadian prison to try to fend off any attempts at extradition. He knew if he was successfully extradited back to the United States, he'd have to face a murder trial and the possibility of the death penalty. He began to educate himself on the American legal system.
For a boy with limited education raised in Hong Kong, he was remarkably adept at knowing the legal system here and how to deal with it.
A guard reported to the prison warden he overheard Ng saying to a fellow inmate, "If you want to delay the system, you just have to fire your lawyers." On October the 17th, 1988, the extradition hearings finally began. Ng lost the case and appealed all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. His appeal was denied.
Within the same day, Charles Ng was placed on an airplane in Canada and flown back to California.
But the pursuit of justice was far from over. Charles Ng had used his time in Canada to arm himself with enough legal knowledge to wage war on the American judicial system. To gain favor with his parole board, LaBerge turned over the cartoons and told authorities the details of his conversations with Ng. One of the most damning cartoons depicted Ng killing a baby.